So we began the semester by talking about what is philosophy. When answering that question, what is philosophy, we split it into four major categories. So we had metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and logic. Next, we looked at ethics in depth. And so we started with metaethics, which is dealing with the question of whether or not there's such a thing as objective moral truth. So we looked at questions about relativism. Then we transitioned over to normative ethics. This is when we're asking questions about how should we live our lives, what type of people should we be. And under normative ethics, we looked at three different schools of thought. So there's utilitarianism, which emphasizes consequences, bringing about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Deontological ethics, which as presented by Kant, deals really heavily with duties or rules. So Kant gave us the categorical imperative. And then we talked about virtue ethics, which it's not so much about consequences or rules, but it's about your character. And so when asking that question, how should I live my life? The virtue ethicist is going to say you should try to develop virtue. You should become a virtuous person. Now, all of this is inching closer and closer towards applied ethics, which is where bioethics is located. So under applied ethics, this is when we're talking about how do we take lessons from metaethics and normative theory, how do we take those lessons and put them to work in concrete scenarios, or how do we apply them to specific professions? So under applied ethics, we have bioethics, which is dealing with issues of right and wrong with respect to the life sciences. But then we also have questions about business ethics, and we look into environmental ethics as well. So all of those subfields are trying to take normative theory and metaethics and actually put it to work to shape policy, to shape decision-making in these particular professions or in these particular contexts. Now, before we jump from normative ethics to applied ethics and start talking about bioethics in particular, there's one more school of thought called Principlism that we need to talk about. Principlism, it's not on the same level as utilitarianism, deontological ethics, and virtue ethics. All three of those schools of thought have kind of comprehensive explanations of what is the good and why does it matter and how should we live. Principlism, on the other hand, is meant to sort of bypass a lot of those deeper questions. So we have conversations about what's the good type of action. Is it the type that maximizes the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Is it the type that follows categorical imperative, or is it about being the right sort of person? Principlism kind of sets all of that aside and almost looks at what's the overlap between these different schools of thought. What sorts of things do they have in common? Can we come up with a list of principles that everyone can agree on? And so the real goal for Principlism is to come up with a list of principles that will help guide our decision-making, especially within medicine. If we can come up with a list of principles that every moral worldview kind of agrees on, then let's just use those, and utilitarians, deontological ethics, they can all have their own debates in their own time, but let's just try to develop a list of principles that everyone can agree on, no matter what their normative theory may be. Now, one interesting point about this too is that Principlism is not going to be a type of relativistic moral theory. They're going to say there really are moral truths, and these truths are expressed in particular principles. So Principlism is going to reject moral relativism, just like utilitarians, deontological ethics, and virtue ethics all reject relativism as well. Now, the reason we talk about Principlism before we dive into applied ethics for the rest of the semester is that Principlism has had a tremendous influence on bioethics. So there's this book called Principles of Biomedical Ethics by Beauchamp and Childress. This project by Beauchamp and Childress has basically shaped all of bioethics in the US for decades. If you really want to understand where we are in bioethics in the US today, go pick up a copy of Principles of Biomedical Ethics by Beauchamp and Childress. And so Principlism, like I said, it's this idea of trying to generate a list of principles that everyone can agree on, no matter what their moral theory, moral background may be, and use those principles to try to guide decision-making in concrete scenarios. So we don't need to have long discussions about what is the virtuous person like, or what would the virtuous person do. We don't need to think about Kant's universalizability test. We don't need to think about the utilitarian calculus. We can set all of that aside and just focus on this particular list of principles that everyone agrees on. And the four major principles for Beauchamp and Childress are non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and autonomy. And to give a quick description of each of these principles, non-maleficence says essentially avoid causing unnecessary harm. Beneficence tells us to benefit others. Justice tells us to treat similar cases similarly, and autonomy tells us that we should respect rational beings. So you have these 4 principles, and these 4 principles are supposed to help you make decisions in concrete scenarios much more effectively and more quickly than any of the other normative theories that we have talked about so far. In that regard, if principlism works, it's almost like using a cheat sheet where we don't have to have these long conversations about normative theory. We can just look really quickly at our cheat sheet and see, does my action violate any of these principles? And if so, what should I do differently? So I'm just going to talk about these principles in order, starting with non-maleficence, and then we'll talk a little bit about how they're supposed to help us make decisions in concrete scenarios. Since this is a course in bioethics, we're going to want to see how do these 4 principles help us make decisions in the context of medical practice especially, as well as things like in the context of medical experimentation and in the life sciences more generally. So starting with non-maleficence. At the most general level, non-maleficence says we ought to act in ways that do not cause needless harm or injury to others. So we're supposed to avoid causing needless harm or injury to anyone else. Now this seems to closely resemble some of the content that you might see in something like the Hippocratic Oath. So the Hippocratic Oath tells us, above all, do no harm. That's just sort of the embodiment of non-maleficence. It's saying, no matter what courses of action you choose as a medical professional or when you're dealing with bioethical questions, you should avoid causing harm. Now this raises a lot of questions though. Suppose you have a patient who has a dislocated shoulder, and the only way that you can treat this condition is to pop it back into place, which is going to be immensely painful. What does non-maleficence say here? Does it say, well, because treating a dislocated shoulder is going to cause a lot of pain, that we shouldn't do it? Because if we don't treat it, that's going to be a harm as well. You have a patient who has an arm that won't function properly. So we've got this choice between, do we treat it and cause a lot of pain, or do we not treat it and cause the patient's function to be disrupted? Either way, it seems like we're going to cause some kind of harm, at least assuming causing pain is causing harm. And here, this is why that word needless is so important. Non-maleficence says we should avoid causing needless harm. That doesn't mean you should always avoid causing harm in every scenario whatsoever. So some treatments are extremely painful. That counts as a kind of harm. If you give a patient a treatment that causes them pain, that's a kind of harm. It's a negative state of affairs. But it's not needless if the treatment is appropriate. So non-maleficence isn't saying you should avoid doing all harm whatsoever. It's saying you should try to minimize the harm that's done. You should try to minimize pain. You should try to minimize suffering when you're giving treatments. But it's different from saying you should try to eliminate all pain whatsoever, or you should eliminate all suffering and eliminate all harm. Practicing medicine doesn't allow for that, because again, too many treatments involve pain and negative side effects. So non-maleficence can't be asking us to avoid negative side effects or causing pain in every scenario whatsoever. Instead, it's just saying, don't cause any more than you have to. Or if you can avoid causing any sort of pain or suffering or discomfort, you should do so. Now, when talking about harm more generally, we can divide it into 2 categories. There's the intentional kind and the unintentional kind. Intentionally harming someone might always be wrong. Purposefully acting in such a way that causes harm to someone, that seems like a bad thing to do. On the other hand, unintentional harm, that's where it's a byproduct of a treatment. It's not something you're causing purposefully. It's something that if you could eliminate it, you would, but the harm occurs through no intention of the person who's acting. So when it comes to medical personnel, it might be the case that non-maleficence says you should never intentionally harm a patient. You should never purposefully do something that damages them or that causes them harm, but it's okay to unintentionally harm them. Say, for example, when a treatment causes a lot of pain or suffering or has negative side effects. That's an unintended harm. It's not something that you want to bring about. It's just something that happens. And you might even foresee it. You might think to yourself, look, I know this particular medication has this bad side effect, and so you foresee the harm happening, but you don't intend it. So it might be okay to cause harm when it's unintended, but never okay to cause harm when it is intended. That being said, though, there's 2 categories of unintended harm that we can talk about as well. There's the culpable kind and the non-culpable kind. So if a harm is unintended, you don't mean for it to happen, it's not something that you want to occur, but you're culpable, that means you're responsible for having caused the harm. So if you unintentionally harm a patient in a culpable manner, that means you're morally responsible. You did something wrong by allowing this harm to happen. Instances of unintended culpable harms might be things like negligence or inattention or carelessness or avoidable ignorance. So for example, suppose a physician is taking medical history on someone and forgets to ask them whether or not they're allergic to various kinds of medications. Suppose further that the physician goes on to give the patient a medication that the patient is allergic to, and the patient has a terrible reaction. Here we could say the physician didn't mean to do anything wrong, but because of their mistake, they caused a type of harm. So it was an unintended harm, but they're still culpable for it. They did something wrong by failing to ask the right questions. So their inattention to detail led to an avoidable harm, and they're responsible for it. So again, you can cause harm in a way that you're morally responsible for it. You did something wrong, even if that harm was unintended. And again, this can happen in cases of negligence, inattention, carelessness, avoidable ignorance. But it can also occur in cases of ordering unnecessary procedures or exposing patients to unnecessary risks. If there's a risky procedure that a physician orders and it's really not indicated, there's no medical reason for ordering this test, but the physician just orders it anyway, that would count as a kind of harm. You can't perform procedures, you can't perform tests, blood tests, whatever, on patients when there's no good medical reason to be performing those tests. So by ordering unnecessary procedures, by exposing patients to unnecessary risks, all of that counts as a violation of non-maleficence. Because non-maleficence, it's telling you you should avoid needless harms. And harms that are the result of inattention, negligence, and all those sorts of things, yeah, they're unintended, but they're needless. They didn't have to happen. And so if the physicians had been doing their job properly, paying attention, and that sort of thing, these harms would have been avoided. In fact, they should have been avoided. And so whenever a harm occurs that should have been avoided, that's a situation where the agent is in violation of non-maleficence. Now lastly, there are going to be cases where bad things happen, but it's not anybody's fault. And so these would be harms that occur, but physicians are not culpable for the harms occurring. So as just one kind of weird example, there's a particular type of amoeba that can enter in through your nose and it eats away at your brain. It sounds terrible, and it is, but when people have this condition, it presents very much like meningitis. And so physicians might look at the symptoms and treat it like meningitis. But if you do that, chances are by the time you catch the actual problem, the patient's not going to have any chance of surviving. So in that case, if the physician had gotten the diagnosis right away, the patient might have had a better chance of survival, but as it is, they diagnosed it incorrectly, and that led to the patient dying. Now in that case, something very bad happens. The patient dies. And in fact, it might have been avoidable. If the physician had gotten the right diagnosis, then they might have been able to prevent this from happening. Maybe, maybe not. But nonetheless, because this condition is so rare, it's not surprising when physicians fail to diagnose it. So when someone presents with meningitis-like symptoms, a responsible doctor might think it's very likely to be meningitis, not this other very, very rare, uncommon disorder. And so we don't blame the physician in that case when they base their diagnosis on the available evidence. The evidence points much more likely to a common medical condition as opposed to a rare one. So a relevant expression here is when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. The idea is, as a physician, when you see a particular set of symptoms, you go with what's most likely to be the case, what's most likely to be the cause. You don't jump right away to rare conditions and say, oh, it must be that. Rather, the responsible doctor is going to look at the evidence and make judgments about what's most likely based on all sorts of statistics and other information. So again, you can have cases where bad things happen to patients and it's not anybody's fault. We can't expect physicians to be perfect all the time. We can only expect them to follow the evidence and make decisions and diagnoses based off of the best available information at the time, and sometimes that means they get it wrong. So just to recap non-maleficence then, it tells us we ought to act in ways that do not cause needless harm. We split harm into two different categories. We said there's intentional harm, and that looks like it's probably always wrong, and unintentional harm, where when you unintentionally harm someone, you might be culpable, in which case you did something morally wrong and you're responsible for the harm, or you're not culpable, in which case the harm occurred, it wasn't intended, and you're not responsible for having caused it. And we saw that this idea of avoiding causing harm seems to even tie back to the Hippocratic Oath. So this idea that physicians should not be harming patients is a very ancient sort of idea. Transitioning then to beneficence, this is kind of giving us a more positive command to do good, to try to benefit people, as opposed to non-maleficence, which is kind of a negative principle saying avoid doing these bad things. So there's a difference between avoiding doing bad and proactively doing good. You can avoid doing bad if you just do nothing at all. But beneficence is saying you can't just do nothing, you actually have to try to benefit people. You have to try to do good, not just avoid doing bad. So beneficence specifically says we should act in ways that promote the welfare of other people. Here, though, we've got serious questions about what counts as welfare. What counts as a benefit to someone? So for example, in medicine, is benefiting someone, is that just about trying to promote their physical health or their mental health, their emotional health? What does it actually mean to benefit someone? And how much should they impose upon patients? So for example, a physician might know by eating a particular healthy diet that's going to be good for their patient. Should they lock their patient up and force them to eat a healthy diet? Or is that going too far? How far can we go in the service of trying to benefit people? And further, when we're talking about benefit, is that going to be defined in terms of Western medicine? So a benefit is understood strictly in a scientific and medical sense? Or are we going to open it up to benefits more generally, spiritual well-being, or in terms of people's religion or other worldviews? What counts as a benefit is going to vary across these different worldviews. And so whose standard, whose definition of a benefit is the right one? We might also ask questions about how much self-sacrifice is involved in trying to honor the principle of beneficence. If I'm told I should be benefiting people, at what cost? Should I give up all of my life savings? Should I spend every spare dollar on donating that to charity to try to promote welfare for others? Where's the limit? Should I invest all of my time in trying to benefit others? Or as a physician, do we expect physicians to sacrifice everything to benefit their patients? Or when we're told we should act in ways that promote the welfare of others, does that mean I have to give up a spare kidney? So if I have 2 kidneys, I have to donate one to benefit others because beneficence is telling me I should promote the welfare of others. And by donating my spare kidney, it's not doing me any good right now, but by donating it, I could benefit someone. So where's the line? Where should I draw the line on how much I have to sacrifice in order to meet the demands of beneficence? So when someone tells you you should do good, you should benefit people, that's not super clear on what that means. What counts as good, what counts as a benefit, that's going to vary by different worldviews. And the question is, which worldview gets the deciding vote? Or maybe we just shouldn't allow one worldview to define benefit over the others. Maybe we should be open to letting people live their lives according to what they see as beneficial or not. A last question that comes up with beneficence then is, who exactly should the medical profession be benefiting? Should they be benefiting individual patients, or should they be benefiting society? So should the medical profession, should it take control of society to try to bring about the greatest good for society? Or should the medical profession be more focused on individual cases where physicians treat patients, individual patients that come into their offices, but then issues of public health, they just kind of leave up to the public to settle on their own? And you see a lot of these questions come up with respect to the pandemic. There's questions about how much control should the medical profession have over public life? What sorts of things should they be able to require? Should agencies like the CDC be able to require people to wear masks all the time? Or is that something that we should just leave up to people to decide for themselves? So what we have then is, when it comes to promoting welfare, we can do that at the societal level, where we're trying to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's a very utilitarian way of thinking. Or we're trying to promote the good of each individual one by one. And that might be more of a Kantian way of thinking, where we empower the individual to make their own choices. So beneficence is telling us promote the well-being of others. Do we promote the well-being of the group or of each individual, even if promoting the well-being of each individual is not the best thing for the group? But in any case, we've got non-maleficence, which tells us to avoid causing needless harm. We've got beneficence, which is telling us to promote the well-being or the welfare of others. And so there's still lots of questions about what these mean. What does it mean to benefit someone? What does it mean to harm someone? And we need to keep talking about that throughout this course. but they're at least giving us a framework to work with, a starting point, when it comes to making decisions in concrete scenarios. The two other principles that we're going to talk about are justice and autonomy. So justice, at its foundation, justice is going to be about treating similar cases similarly. So two patients that have similar medical conditions should be treated similarly. That means if one patient receives treatment and the other patient doesn't, for some arbitrary reason, that's unjust. And so you might compare two cases. Take, for example, two patients. Both of them need the same medication for the same condition, and if they don't get this medication on a daily basis, they can't survive without it. One patient can pay for it and the other patient can't. Justice might require that we treat these cases similarly. And so we either give the medication to both or we withhold it from both. So there's two ways in which you could treat these cases similarly. You could say, okay, whether you can pay for the medication or not, we're going to give it to you. Or you could say, since not everybody can pay for this medication, we have to treat everyone the same, and so nobody gets it. Or there's another option even. Justice might tell us treat similar cases similarly, and so then we just apply the same principle to everyone, which is if you can pay for medication that you need, you can receive it. If you can't pay for it, then you don't receive it. And we treat everyone like that. That could be just in the sense that every single individual is treated exactly the same. Whether they get the medication or not, that's dependent on their financial situation, but we're still treating everyone the same. If you can afford it, you can get it. If you can't afford it, you can't get it. And what this points out then is that when we talk about treating similar cases similarly, what makes two cases similar? Is it the financial status of people that we're comparing? The social status? Is it their health, their age? What is it that makes cases similar? And there's a couple of different ways we might answer that. We might say, okay, when it comes to distribution of resources, for example, the just way to distribute is to just give everyone an equal share of everything. So this would be distributing according to the principle of equality, which just says everyone gets an equal share of whatever public resources there are. Or to put it a little bit differently, we might say justice according to the principle of equality would say we distribute equally among everyone the benefits and the burdens that come with being in this particular society. So no one group of people gets all the benefits, no one group of people has to bear all the burdens, but we evenly distribute benefits and burdens across the population. When it comes to healthcare, though, this is going to cause all sorts of problems. If we were to distribute resources equally, it might be the case that everyone gets a set amount of money to deal with their medical issues. So let's just say that we decide to set up society to give every single person in society $10,000 to deal with whatever their medical issues are each year. So everyone gets $10,000 a year to deal with their medical issues. That's going to be too much for some people, and that's going to be way too little for a lot of other people. So if we distribute our resources equally, giving everyone an equal share of everything, you're probably going to end up with people who have way too much, and you're going to end up with people who have way too little. And so distributing equally like that might actually cause a lot of problems for people. You're certainly not going to be giving enough resources to the people who have extra needs. So okay, maybe we throw out the idea that the just way of distributing our resources is to just give everyone an equal share. Throw that idea out. Maybe we do it based on need. So we say in the medical context, if one person has $100,000 of medical bills in a year and a second person has $0, then society gives that first person $100,000 and it gives the second person $0. So we distribute resources based on need. If you have a lot of needs, then you get a lot of resources. If you don't have a lot of needs, then you don't get a lot of resources. And the idea there would be everyone has their needs met equally. So we treat similar cases similarly in that if you have a particular need, it's going to be taken care of. And if you don't have a need, then you're on your own because you don't need any extra help. Now, one objection here is that this is going to be unfair to people who are working really hard within society. And furthermore, maybe even worse, it might incentivize people to not take care of their own needs. So if I know society is just going to take care of my needs, no matter what they may be, no matter what I do, no matter how hard I'm working, maybe I'll just sit back and let society pay for all of my needs. So if we distribute based on need, where society is trying to meet the needs of every single person, it might disincentivize people from working hard. This is at least an objection against the view. So we saw distributing equally, that has some problems. distributing based on need, maybe that's going to generate problems. But when it comes down to justice, the fundamental thing to remember is you must treat similar cases similarly, and so you can't pick and choose which patients that you want to treat based on arbitrary criteria. You can't treat only those patients that you like, for example. If two patients are comparable and they present with the same problem, and you treat the one that you like and you don't treat the person that you don't like, that's unjust. That's unfair. From a medical standpoint, medical personnel have to treat everyone equally. They have to treat everyone similarly. And then, of course, we just have to debate about what does it mean for people to be equal? What does it mean for them to be treated similarly? So if you had to sum it up, justice involves treating similar cases in a similar way. And so if you're treating some patients in one way but treating other patients in a different way for arbitrary reasons because you don't like them or whatever, that's unjust. And according to Principlism, you can't do that. Lastly, there's this principle of autonomy, which tells us rational individuals should be permitted to be self-determining. That is, we should respect people's choices, respect the choices they make. So you should be free to make your own decisions about how you want to live your life. We tend to value autonomy in this society because it allows you to shape your own life in the way you see fit. So you have the right, for example, to pursue your own vision of happiness, whatever that may be. And so when it comes to a medical context, the idea might be something like, if a patient wants a particular treatment for their condition, then honoring their autonomy, honoring their choice, means giving them that treatment. Alternatively, if a patient doesn't want a particular treatment, say a patient needs a blood transfusion to survive, but they're saying, no, this goes against my religion and I don't want it, honoring their autonomy, allowing them to be self-determining would mean not treating them. And so here you have a case where if we're going to honor their autonomy, you have to just not treat them, even though you know it's going to lead to their death. And there are tons of ways in which autonomy might be threatened in a medical context. So if you coerce a patient, you force them to get a particular treatment, that's undermining autonomy. That's not allowing the person to be self-determining. Whether it's justified to undermine their autonomy or not, we're going to get to that. But at the very least, if physicians go against the free choice of a patient, that's threatening their autonomy. So we said coercion or forcing someone to do something, that undermines their autonomy. Intimidation is another way that you undermine autonomy too. So if you cause somebody to be so fearful that they just go along with your plan and they're too afraid to resist your plan, that's undermining their autonomy. By causing so much fear, you're pressuring them to do something that they don't want. Whereas if you were to honor their autonomy, you'd say, okay, you're a self-governing creature, you should make your own decisions free of my influence, and so I'm not going to try to intimidate you into doing something. One last way that you might undermine somebody's autonomy in medicine is by failing to let them know what their options are. So if you just tell a patient, okay, you have this particular condition, here's how we're going to treat it, and that's where you stop, you don't give them any sort of options, you don't give them any sort of choice, that's undermining their autonomy because you're making the choice for them. You're telling them, here's what we're going to do. You don't really have a choice in the matter, but here's what we're going to do. Here's the treatment we're going to give you. That undermines the patient's autonomy because according to this principle, the patient should have the choice about which treatments they get and which ones they don't, and so on. People should be free to govern their own lives as they see fit. Now, all that being said, there are going to be cases where it's actually okay to undermine somebody's autonomy. What these cases are, that's a subject of debate, but pretty much everyone in bioethics will agree that there are some limits to personal autonomy. You might think, for example, that if someone is trying to hurt other people, it's okay to restrain them. So if somebody is threatening the lives of other people, if somebody is threatening harm, it's okay to prevent them from doing that. We don't have to say, well, they're free to live their lives as they see fit, so if they want to go hurt people, that's fine. Instead, we say, no, you don't actually have the right to choose to hurt people. So one way I've heard this phrase before is, your right to use your fist ends where my face begins. In other words, you're free to live your life as you see fit. You can do what you want, make your own choices, govern your own life, until you start interfering with the rights of other people. And once you start interfering with the rights of other people, that's when we can say, as a society, your right to autonomy, your right to choice ends. So I don't have the right to go steal my neighbor's car. I don't have the right to just take whatever I want, because that would interfere with other people's rights. Now, as long as I'm living my life in a way that doesn't interfere with anybody else's rights, that's fine. This means the principle of autonomy is basically saying people should be free to live their lives as they see fit up until the point that they start interfering with the lives of others. And when that happens, when you start interfering with other people's rights, then society can sanction you or prevent you from acting on whatever it is you want to do. Now, there are other cases in which we might limit autonomy, we might limit free choice as well. If someone poses a harm to themselves, for example, we might think it's okay for society to step in and prevent them from harming themselves. Or if somebody is struggling with a drug addiction that's going to kill them, you might say it's okay for society to step in and help them overcome that. Whether they want that or not, it's okay for society to step in when somebody's behavior or actions are self-destructive. That's what we might call weak paternalism, where the state or society steps in to stop people from hurting themselves. Autonomy by itself would say let people live their lives how they see fit, but there are limitations on it, like weak paternalism, which says it's okay to step in and limit autonomy when someone's going to be hurting themselves. Strong paternalism, on the other hand, says it's okay to step in and undermine somebody's autonomy when society can benefit that person. So this would be like the case of someone who's against vaccines, physicians coming in and saying, no, you have to get this vaccine, and forcing the patient to get it. That would be a case where society, or in this case medical personnel, are forcing someone to get something that's a benefit to them, even though they don't want it. So the patient is saying, I don't want this treatment, I don't want this vaccine, I don't want anything to do with it, and the medical personnel is saying, too bad, we're going to give it to you anyway. So this is strong paternalism in that you're limiting autonomy for the sake of benefiting the person whose autonomy you're limiting. You're saying, I know better than you what's good for you, and so I'm going to force you to do what's good for yourself. So again, when it comes to limiting autonomy, it seems like it's okay to limit autonomy when somebody's free choice interferes with someone else's rights. Maybe it's okay to limit autonomy when someone poses a threat to themselves. So you step in and you prevent them from acting on the choice to harm themselves. And some people are going to argue it's okay to step in and control somebody's life when doing so is good for them. And this matters because when it comes to principlism, so we've got these 4 principles now: non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and autonomy. Autonomy tends to dominate the other 3 principles in bioethics today. So the idea that the patient's choice is pretty much absolute, it should override the decisions of medical teams, that has a strong place in bioethics today. It's again this idea that people should be self-determining, they should be allowed to pursue their own vision of the good. Physicians and medical personnel don't have a right to step in and control their lives. And so medical personnel are stuck in a situation where they know their patient is doing something unhealthy, but they can't do anything to force them to stop being unhealthy. And so, like I said, there's tension between these 4 principles. These 4 principles, they can be in conflict with one another, and in fact, they often are. So think about somebody who's addicted to painkillers coming into a doctor's office and saying, please prescribe me this particular medication. If the physician were to honor the patient's autonomy, they would just do whatever the patient said. If the physician goes ahead and prescribes painkillers to this patient, that's harmful. That's enabling a harmful addiction. And so the physician has to choose between principles. Do you honor the patient's autonomy and write the prescription that you know is going to be harmful? Or do you honor non-maleficence and you refuse to harm the patient, even though that means undermining the patient's autonomy? So these principles are going to be in conflict all the time, and that's not a criticism of principlism, that's just how it works. But principlism is supposed to help us with decision making in medicine. So the question is, how does it help? How do these 4 principles help us make decisions? And the answer is, it's not always going to be possible to honor all 4 principles, but they give us a starting point for the conversation. We can evaluate courses of action according to each of these principles. Even though they're in conflict, they give us some tools to work with when we're navigating through moral issues. We can ask questions about, does this particular action violate the patient's autonomy? Okay, if it does violate their autonomy, is it one of those cases where it's okay to violate autonomy or not? Or we can ask questions about, which course of treatment causes the least amount of harm? Which course of treatment satisfies the principle of non-maleficence the best? Or which course of treatment is going to be most beneficial to this patient? These principles are just giving us some tools to work with when we're trying to navigate through moral territory. But ultimately, the principles are supposed to help us form a justified decision. When going back and explaining why did you act the way that you did, you can say, okay, well, I acted this way because it was going to honor the patient's autonomy, it wasn't going to cause them a whole lot of harm, and so on. You have some sort of story to tell about why you chose which option you chose. So in this class, when we're looking at case studies, which is going to start in just a couple days, students can look back and say, all right, here's a course of action that I think is the right one because it honors the patient's autonomy. And they can use that as part of their defense for why they choose which option they think is right. It just gives you some quick tools that you can refer to when having discussions in bioethics about which courses of action are right and which are wrong. You can use these principles as explanations for why you're choosing the options you choose. So just to recap, we've talked about principlism. It's not its own normative theory, but in some ways it's trying to bypass normative theory. It's trying to get a collection of principles that everyone can agree on. So the utilitarian, deontological ethicist, virtue ethicist, we can all agree that justice is good. So justice is one of the foundational principles that we have to honor. It's supposed to work as almost a cheat sheet where you just have these quick answers that you can try to apply in concrete situations. That said, when you start to challenge the principlist and say, well, why does justice matter? Why does non-maleficence matter? They're not going to have a very detailed answer to give you. They're just going to say, well, kind of everyone agrees on these principles, so we're just using them as a guide for action. But principlists don't have a big story to tell about why these are the right principles as opposed to some other set. So we saw with Beauchamp and Childress, there are 4 principles that are central to their view. We have non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and autonomy. Non-maleficence tells us we ought to act in ways that avoid causing needless harm. So yeah, some harm is inevitable, but as long as it's unintentional and as long as you're acting in such a way that you're not culpable for causing harm, that's okay. So you're avoiding needless harm. Beneficence tells you that you should promote the welfare of others. We had questions about, does that mean the individual patient or society at large? Justice tells us we should treat similar cases similarly, so we can't draw arbitrary lines between one group of patients and another group of patients. We can't play favorites. We have to treat all of our patients similarly, or medical personnel have to treat all their patients similarly. Researchers have to treat their experimental subjects in similar ways as well. You can't pick one group of people for a research study and ignore other groups. You have to treat everyone fairly. And then finally, the principle of autonomy, which honestly is probably the biggest one today, the most popular one today. It's sometimes referred to as the first principle among equals. So these 4 principles, they're supposed to be on equal ground, they're supposed to be balanced with one another. But again, autonomy tends to dominate the other ones because as a society we have these strong inclinations that people should be free to live their lives as they see fit, as long as they're not interfering with the rights of other people. And then we looked at some cases in which autonomy might be limited. So we might limit somebody's free choice when they're harming themselves. We certainly are going to limit their free choice when they're interfering with rights of others. And then maybe it's okay to limit their free choice when doing so is good for them. And that's where we're going to pick up in the next class. We're going to be looking at case studies where physicians ignored the wishes of patients and chose to give them a treatment against their will because in the physician's mind, this was what was best for the patients. So we're getting to that. For the meantime, if you have any questions about principlism, any questions about these 4 principles, or how they're supposed to help us make decisions, let me know in the discussion board and I'll get back to you there.